North Africa. Tunisia. May 1943. The war in North Africa was over. The last Axis forces had surrendered on May 13, 1943, a capitulation so total, so sudden in its finality, that men who had been fighting for 3 years found themselves sitting in the dust of a Tunisian airfield with nothing to do but wait and think. General Lieutenant Fritz Kraus, a career officer who had served in Poland, in France, in the grinding campaigns of the Eastern Front before being transferred to Rommel's command, sat with his back against a wire fence and watched the Americans move through the compound with the particular efficiency of people who had prepared for this moment long in advance. They were distributing something. He watched a young American soldier, barely 20, it seemed, sunburned and unhurried, moving down the line of prisoners with a canvas bag, handing each man a small glass bottle. Dark liquid. A metal cap crimped at the top. A paper label in red and white. The soldier reached Kraus and held out a bottle without expression. Kraus took it. He turned it over. He read the label. Coca-Cola. He knew the name. Every German officer of his generation knew the name. But knowing the name and holding the bottle, cold, impossibly cold, in the heat of a Tunisian afternoon, were two entirely different things. He looked up at the young soldier, who had already moved on. He looked back at the bottle. He opened it and drank. He would spend the next 4 years trying to explain to himself exactly what had happened to him in that moment, and failing. This is only one piece of the story. We've already covered the K-ration, the D-ration chocolate bar, and the spam that fed 12 million Soviet soldiers, and there's much more to come. Hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in America's most unlikely war machine. To understand why a bottle of Coca-Cola in the hands of a German prisoner of war carried the psychological weight it did, you must first understand the history of that bottle, not merely as a beverage, but as a deliberate instrument of American strategic policy, engineered and deployed with a sophistication that the word soft drink does nothing to suggest. Coca-Cola had been invented in 1886 by pharmacist John Pemberton in Atlanta, Georgia. By 1940, it was the most recognized commercial product in the United States and one of the most recognized in the world, sold in more than 70 countries, its distinctive contour bottle as instantly legible as any flag or uniform. The company had, by this point, spent half a century building not merely a market but a mythology. The idea that Coca-Cola was not just a product but an experience, not just a drink but a symbol of the American way of life. Its optimism, its abundance, its specific flavor of happiness that was democratic and individual simultaneously, available to everyone, tasting the same for everyone. This mythology was not accidental. It was the result of one of the most ambitious marketing campaigns in commercial history, and it had saturated American culture so completely that by 1941, when the United States entered the Second World War, Coca-Cola was not simply associated with American life. It was American life in a way that no other single product matched. Robert Woodruff, the president of the Coca-Cola Company, understood this. And in the weeks following Pearl Harbor, he made a declaration that would reshape not only his company's wartime role but the psychological architecture of the American war effort. He announced that every American soldier in uniform, wherever in the world that soldier might be serving, would be able to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, the standard domestic price, regardless of the cost to the company of getting it there. 5 cents. The same price as at a diner in Cincinnati or a drugstore in Memphis. Whether the soldier was in England or North Africa or the jungles of New Guinea or the frozen islands of the Aleutian chain. 5 cents. This was, on its surface, a commercial commitment of remarkable ambition. Beneath the surface, it was something more. It was a promise to the American soldier that the world he had left behind had not forgotten him. That the small pleasures of civilian life, the ordinary transactions, the casual moments at a lunch counter, the specific cold sweetness of a bottle of Coke on a hot afternoon, were being maintained for him, carried forward across oceans and through war zones, waiting for him on the other side. That home was not simply a memory but a living thing that traveled with him. The Germans, who had no equivalent promise and no equivalent product, did not initially understand what Woodruff had done. They would learn. Slowly, through the evidence of battle after battle, prisoner after prisoner, campaign after campaign. They would learn that Robert Woodruff, sitting in his office in Atlanta in December 1941, had just made a decision as strategically consequential as anything made by any general in any war room. He had decided to weaponize joy. The first sustained German encounter with Coca-Cola as a military phenomenon came in North Africa in late 1942, following the American landings of Operation Torch. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from this period note, with varying degrees of analytical depth, the presence of Coca-Cola in American supply chains, not as a curiosity but as a documented logistical commitment. American forces were receiving Coca-Cola. In the field, in a combat zone, moving through the same supply arteries as ammunition and fuel and blood plasma. German supply officers reading these reports had a consistent reaction, disbelief shading into contempt. The idea that a military power would consume shipping capacity, the same shipping tonnage that carried the rifles and the shells and the food, on a carbonated soft drink was, to the German military mind, evidence of a fundamental unseriousness about war. The Wehrmacht was, by late 1942, rationing fuel so tightly that tank crews sometimes pushed their vehicles by hand to preserve reserves for combat operations. The Luftwaffe's supply convoys across the Mediterranean were being savaged by Allied air interdiction. German soldiers in Tunisia were eating half rations, and their letters home described hunger with a frankness that the military censors did not always catch in time. Into this world came intelligence reports describing American forces receiving Coca-Cola. The reaction in German officer circles was something between laughter and fury. It confirmed every preconception. The Americans were rich children playing at soldiers, unwilling to endure the hardships that real warfare demanded, so attached to their civilian comforts that they dragged those comforts into the theater of war like toys they could not leave behind. An army that needed soft drinks was an army that had not yet understood what war was. They were wrong. But the nature of this specific wrongness deserves the most careful examination of any misconception in this story, because it touches on something fundamental about the difference between German and American strategic culture. A difference that was not about toughness or courage or willpower, qualities both armies possessed in abundance, but about something more subtle, the understanding of what sustains a fighting force over years of modern industrial warfare. The German military tradition, rooted in the Prussian ideal of the soldier as a hardened instrument of state power, had a complicated relationship with the concept of morale. It acknowledged morale's importance. Every military tradition does, but it located the sources of morale primarily in ideology, in unit cohesion, in the personal example of officers, in the belief in the justice of the cause. Material comfort was, in this framework, at best a secondary factor and at worst a corrosive one. Soldiers who grew accustomed to comfort became dependent on it, and dependency was weakness. American military doctrine took a different view. One shaped by a democratic political culture that had always been more attentive to the preferences and needs of the individual, and by the specific circumstances of the American war effort, an all-volunteer and selective service military drawing men from a civilian society of genuine abundance, asking them to leave that abundance behind and endure conditions of profound deprivation for an indefinite period. The American soldier was not, in the German sense, a professional warrior shaped from childhood by a military culture. He was, in most cases, a civilian who had been a soldier for somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, a man who remembered, vividly and specifically, what ordinary life felt like. For that man, The maintenance of small connections to civilian life was not a luxury. It was a psychological lifeline. It was the material evidence that the world he was fighting for still existed, that the sacrifices he was making were in service of something real and specific and recoverable, not just an abstraction called freedom or democracy, but the actual, physical, sensory experience of American life. The cold bottle at the lunch counter, the specific sweetness of the formula that had not changed in 50 years, the 5-cent transaction that meant he was still, however briefly, a civilian buying it. Robert Woodruff's declaration was, viewed in this light, a stroke of psychological genius. He had understood something about the American soldier that German military planners had never thought to study, that the distance between a man's present conditions and his remembered life is a form of suffering, and that reducing that distance, even symbolically, even through something as apparently trivial as a soft drink, reduces the suffering and therefore sustains the capacity to endure. To get Coca-Cola to the soldiers who needed it, Woodruff negotiated with the U.S. government a designation that was without precedent in the history of American business. Coca-Cola was classified as an essential war material. Its syrup was exempted from the wartime sugar rationing that applied to all other civilian food manufacturers, a concession of extraordinary commercial value and even more extraordinary political symbolism. The government was, in effect, declaring that Coca-Cola was as necessary to the war effort as steel or rubber. To deliver on his 5-cent promise, Woodruff worked with the Army to design and deploy a network of portable bottling plants, units that could be dismantled, shipped in crates, reassembled in the field, and operated by soldiers trained specifically for the purpose. These men were given a military designation, technical observers, or TOs. In practice, they were Coca-Cola technicians in uniform, deployed to every major theater of the war to ensure that wherever American soldiers were fighting, a cold bottle of Coke was never more than a reasonable distance away. By the end of the war, 64 of these portable bottling plants had been deployed to combat theaters worldwide. They had produced approximately 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola for American military personnel. 5 billion. The logistical apparatus required to achieve this, the shipping of syrup concentrate, the local sourcing of carbonated water, the maintenance of refrigeration in environments ranging from the Sahara to the South Pacific, the management of bottle returns in combat zones, was, in its own domain, as sophisticated and demanding as any purely military supply operation. The Technical Observers Program, the name given to the Coca-Cola technicians deployed in military uniform to the combat theaters, deserves more than a footnote. These were civilian employees of the Coca-Cola Company who were given military ranks and uniforms and shipped overseas not to fight but to bottle. They were, in the most literal sense possible, the embodiment of the connection between American civilian life and American military power. They arrived in North Africa with crates of equipment and a mandate to solve whatever engineering problem stood between a soldier and a cold Coke. They drilled wells for water when municipal supplies were unavailable. They improvised refrigeration using military equipment not designed for the purpose. They negotiated with local suppliers in languages they did not speak through interpreters who did not always understand the technical vocabulary involved. They were, by every account that survives, extraordinarily resourceful. There is something almost philosophical about their existence. In the German military tradition, the soldier was defined by his willingness to kill and to die. Support functions, logistics, supply, maintenance, were necessary but somewhat diminished categories, the work of men who were not quite soldiers. The idea of deploying a soft drinks technician in uniform, giving him a military designation and a rank, and treating the quality of his output as a matter of operational importance would have been, to most German officers, faintly absurd. To Eisenhower, it was obvious. The war would be long. The men fighting it were human beings with human needs. Meeting those needs was not a distraction from the military mission. It was part of the military mission. And if meeting those needs required putting a Coca-Cola bottling plant on a warship and sailing it into a combat theater, then that was precisely what you did. German intelligence, which tracked this program with increasing attention through 1943 and 1944, revised its assessment of the Coca-Cola question several times as the evidence accumulated. The initial contempt gave way to puzzlement, and puzzlement gave way to something that German intelligence officers did not always commit to paper directly, but that is readable between the lines of their assessments. A grudging, unwilling recognition that something real was happening. That the American soldiers receiving these bottles were not being coddled. They were being managed, with extraordinary care and institutional intelligence, as the human instruments of a war that their commanders understood would be decided by endurance as much as by firepower. The German propaganda ministry, for its part, attempted to turn Coca-Cola against the Americans. Goebbels' apparatus produced material characterizing the American soldier as a creature of commerce, a man who could not survive 24 hours without his consumer goods, whose fighting spirit was dependent on corporate supply chains rather than ideological conviction. This was, in its internal logic, a reasonable critique. It simply happened to be aimed at a strength rather than a weakness. The American soldier's connection to his civilian life was not a vulnerability to be exploited. It was the source of the particular ferocity with which he fought. He was not fighting for an abstraction. He was fighting to go home. He was fighting for the lunch counter and the Coke and the afternoon he remembered. Give a man something specific to fight for, and he fights differently than a man fighting for an ideology. The Germans had built an army of ideological warriors. The Americans had built something subtler, an army of sustained individuals. And sustaining an individual, it turned out, was partly a matter of 5 cents and cold syrup in a Conter bottle. The mathematics of Coca-Cola's wartime presence are staggering enough to require careful presentation, because the numbers are large enough to seem invented and real enough to be verified. The bottling plant network, 64 portable bottling plants were designed, manufactured, and deployed to combat theaters between 1942 and 1945. Each plant was capable of producing thousands of bottles per day, depending on local conditions and the availability of carbonated water. The plants were operational in theaters including North Africa, the European Theater of Operations, the Pacific, India, and the China-Burmandia Theater. Setting up a portable Coca-Cola bottling operation in, for example, the jungles of New Guinea, sourcing local water, establishing refrigeration, maintaining quality consistency with the domestic product, was an engineering problem of genuine complexity. It was solved repeatedly by men whose civilian expertise was in beverage manufacturing and whose military rank was often the lowest available. Total production, approximately 5 billion servings of Coca-Cola were provided to American military personnel between 1941 and 1945. This figure, drawn from Coca-Cola Company records and the U.S. Army Quartermaster reports, encompasses both bottled Coke produced at the field plants and syrup-based servings from mobile dispensing units that operated closer to the front lines. 5 billion servings, distributed to a military force that peaked at approximately 12 million personnel, represents a per capita distribution rate of roughly 416 servings per soldier over the course of the war, or approximately 1 serving per soldier every 3 to 4 days across the entire conflict. The sugar exemption, the wartime sugar rationing that applied to American civilian food manufacturers, reduced their access to refined sugar by approximately 50 to 70% depending on the production year. Coca-Cola's exemption from this rationing, obtained through its classification as essential war material, gave the company access to sugar supplies that were explicitly denied to commercial competitors. This was not a trivial advantage. Sugar was one of the most tightly controlled food commodities of the wartime economy. The government's decision to prioritize Coca-Cola syrup production above most civilian sweet production was a policy statement about what the government considered important, and it tells you everything about how seriously the American military establishment took the morale argument. What Germany had instead, the German military's approach to morale-sustaining beverages was not entirely without sophistication. Coca-Cola, the caffeine-enhanced chocolate issued to paratroops and Luftwaffe crews, has already appeared in this series. Jägermeister and Schnapps were distributed to soldiers in measured quantities, particularly in the brutal winters of the Eastern Front. Malzkaffee, malt coffee, a grain-based substitute, was the standard hot drink issued when real coffee ran out, which it did with increasing frequency from 1942 onward. And brause, a generic term for carbonated lemon-flavored powder drinks, was occasionally available. None of these were equivalent, not because they were inferior as beverages in an absolute sense, but because none of them carried the symbolic freight of the Coca-Cola bottle. They were sustenance. They were comfort in a narrow physical sense. But they were not meaning. They did not say, "The country that you left behind has not forgotten you. The life you are fighting for still exists. Here it is in this bottle, cold and specific and exactly as you remember it." They were drinks. Coca-Cola was a message. The difference between those two things, between a drink and a message, was not measurable in calories or caffeine content. It was measurable in something more difficult to quantify and more decisive in the long run: the willingness of a man to keep going. The psychological mechanism by which Coca-Cola functioned as a morale instrument has been studied extensively in the decades since the war, and what that research reveals is both simpler and more profound than the original wartime intuition that guided Woodruff's decision. Human beings are, among other things, creatures of association. The brain does not process sensory experience in isolation. It processes it in context, linking what the senses detect to the stored emotional and narrative content that previous encounters with the same sensory input have deposited. A smell, a taste, a sound can carry, instantaneously and involuntarily, an entire emotional world. This is not metaphor. It is neuroscience, the mechanism by which the olfactory and gustatory systems connect directly to the hippocampus and amygdala, the brain structures responsible for memory formation and emotional processing. Coca-Cola, by 1941, had been consumed by American soldiers since childhood. Its taste, that specific combination of carbonation, caramel sweetness, phosphoric acid bite, and the trace of vanilla and cinnamon in the original formula, was not merely a flavor. It was a sensory archive. It contained, for most American men of that generation, the taste of summer afternoons, of drugstore lunch counters, of baseball games and family barbecues and the ordinary civilian pleasures that the war had suspended. When a soldier opened a bottle of Coke in a foxhole in Sicily or on a beach in the Pacific and drank it, even warm, even badly bottled, even in conditions of acute physical misery, he was not simply ingesting a beverage. He was, for a moment, so. That moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The bottle was empty. The foxhole was still a foxhole. The war had not paused. But 30 seconds of genuine emotional relief, of the specific neurological state produced by the fulfillment of a deeply conditioned positive association, is not nothing. Repeated thousands of times across millions of soldiers over years of war, those 30 seconds accumulate into something that has no precise military designation but is recognizable by every commander who has ever tried to sustain an army through a long campaign. It is the difference between men who are enduring and men who are breaking. American military commanders understood this with a clarity that is documented throughout the archival record. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his capacity as Supreme Allied Commander, personally intervened on multiple occasions to prioritize Coca-Cola shipments to frontline units. In one documented exchange from 1943, Eisenhower requested the establishment of 10 portable bottling plants in North Africa with an urgency that, in his cable to Washington, he placed alongside requests for ammunition and medical supplies. He was not being frivolous. He was making a precise calculation about what his soldiers needed to keep fighting effectively, and Coca-Cola was on that list. General George Patton, whose relationship with soldier welfare was characteristically complex. He believed in both maximum physical hardship during training and maximum physical comfort during operations, made similar calculations. Patton's Third Army supply records from the European campaign include specific allocations for Coca-Cola distribution that were tracked with the same administrative rigor as fuel and rations. 4 German soldiers encountering Coca-Cola in captured American supply depots, in the hands of American prisoners, in the possession of liberated civilians who had received it through various channels. The reaction evolved across the course of the war in ways that mirror the broader evolution of German understanding of the American war effort. Early in the war, it was a joke. The Americans needed their soda pop. Weikling, softies. The contempt was genuine and largely unexamined. By mid-war, it had become something more complicated. Letters from German soldiers captured in North Africa and held in American prisoner-of-war facilities. Letters that survived the war in both American military archives and German family collections, describe encounters with Coca-Cola in the camps with a consistent undertone of something that is difficult to name precisely but that reads, in retrospect, as a kind of grief. Not for the drink itself. For what the drink represented, the existence, on the other side of the wire, of a civilization so confident in its own survival that it was still making soft drinks, still shipping them across oceans, still ensuring that its soldiers had them cold. One letter, written by a captured Feldwebel from the 15th Panzer Division and preserved in the U.S. National Archives, contains a passage that has been cited by several historians of the American prisoner-of-war program. They gave us American soda water today. The same kind they sell at home in their shops, I think. I cannot tell you why this made me feel as I did. I only know that I drank it and afterward I sat for a long time without speaking. He could not articulate what he felt. What he felt was the weight of an asymmetry that had no military solution. The enemy was not merely stronger in the narrow tactical sense. The enemy was operating in a different relationship with time, with the future, than the army he was part of. An army that ships Coca-Cola to its soldiers in a combat zone is an army that believes it will still exist when the war is over. That belief is not trivial. It is the foundation of everything. The strategic implications of Coca-Cola's wartime role extend in directions that would have been impossible to predict in 1941 and that remain, in some respects, underappreciated by military historians who are more comfortable with tank production rates and sortie frequencies than with the sociology of cold beverages. The most direct consequence was the one Woodruff and Eisenhower had intended: sustained morale in a military force that was, by the nature of the American war, fighting far from home, in conditions of hardship, for a duration that none of them had originally anticipated. The American soldier of 1944, 2 or 3 years into his service, having fought in North Africa and Sicily and through the hedgerows of Normandy, was not the same man who had enlisted in 1941. He was tired, experienced, sometimes cynical, and deeply impatient to go home. Keeping that man fighting effectively required not just supply and leadership and tactical competence, but the daily maintenance of his conviction that the world he was fighting for was real and worth the cost. Coca-Cola was part of that maintenance. Not the largest part. No one serious would claim that the outcome of the war turned on the 5-cent bottle. But it was a visible, tangible, daily expression of the commitment the American government and the American civilian establishment had made to its soldiers. We have not forgotten you. We are thinking about what you need. We are spending real resources to provide it. That commitment, expressed through Coca-Cola as through the K-ration and the blood bank and the mail system and the USO shows, created a feedback loop of loyalty and effectiveness that the German military system, for all its tactical sophistication, could not replicate. German soldiers were asked to sacrifice. American soldiers were asked to sacrifice too, but they were also told, constantly and in concrete material terms, that their sacrifice was being honored. The difference in psychological experience was not subtle. The second strategic consequence was one that Woodruff had not entirely planned but that history delivered anyway. Coca-Cola's presence in the war became the foundation for its global commercial expansion in the decades that followed. The 64 portable bottling plants that had been deployed to war theaters around the world left behind, when they were decommissioned or transferred to local partners at the war's end, a global distribution infrastructure and a globally primed consumer base. Millions of people in Europe, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in India had tasted Coca-Cola for the first time because American soldiers had brought it with them. Many of them wanted more. The post-war Coca-Cola expansion, which made the contour bottle one of the most recognized objects on the planet by the 1950s, was not built from nothing. It was built on the wartime distribution network that the U.S. Army had funded and the American taxpayer had, in a sense, subsidized through the sugar exemption and the shipping allocation. The soft drink that the Wehrmacht had laughed at as evidence of American softness became, in the decade after the war, the most potent single symbol of the American century, of the global cultural dominance that the United States established in the wake of military victory. Germany, which had laughed at the bottle, watched this happen with the particular discomfort of a nation that had misread its enemy at every level, from the strategic to the symbolic. There was a bitterness in this that the German military establishment never fully articulated but that runs through the post-war testimonies and memoirs of its surviving officers like a persistent low note. The recognition that the enemy had not simply outproduced them in tanks and aircraft and ships, but had outthought them in a domain they had not even recognized as a domain. The Americans had made science of morale. They had measured what soldiers needed to endure, and they had supplied it. They had understood that a war fought by citizen soldiers, by men who chose their country's cause over their own safety, whose commitment was voluntary and therefore required constant renewal, was a different war than a war fought by conscripts commanded by an authoritarian state. Different in its demands, different in its vulnerabilities, and different, ultimately, in its capacity for endurance. The Wehrmacht had asked its soldiers to be hard. The U.S. Army had asked its soldiers to be sustained. Both armies produced extraordinary fighting forces. Only one of them built the logistical and political culture that had sent those soldiers to war in the first place. A democracy fights differently than an autocracy, not necessarily with more individual heroism, but with a different relationship between the state and the citizen soldier. The American state, in Robert Woodruff's declaration and Dwight Eisenhower's supply cable, was reminding its soldiers that the contract between them was real and being honored. Krauss returned to Germany in 1946. He lived long enough to see Coca-Cola become available in West German shops in the early 1950s, first in the cities, then spreading outward as the distribution network expanded. He bought a bottle once, the story goes, at a kiosk near the main train station in Frankfurt. He drank it standing on the pavement, in the gray morning of a post-war German city being slowly rebuilt. He did not say what he thought. He finished the bottle. He set it carefully on the pavement next to the kiosk. And he walked away into the city that his generation had destroyed and the Marshall Plan, another American idea, in the same tradition as the bottle in his hand, was now rebuilding. There is a continuity here that is worth naming. The Marshall Plan, the $13 billion American program to rebuild Western European economies after the war, was, at its deepest level, the same idea as Robert Woodruff's 5-cent declaration. It was the expression of a civilization that had internalized, at an institutional level, the understanding that sustained human beings are more valuable than broken ones. That feeding people, rebuilding their cities, restoring their ability to live ordinary lives, was not charity. It was strategy. It was the recognition that a world in which people had enough to eat and enough to hope for was a world that did not produce the conditions for another war. The Germans had built a war economy. The Americans had built a war economy too, but underneath it, running through it, sustaining it, was something that the German system lacked. The conviction, psychological infrastructure to keep those forces fighting effectively through 4 years of global industrial warfare. The bottle had always been telling them something. They had chosen not to hear it. General Lieutenant Krauss spent 3 years in an American prisoner of war facility in Georgia. He was, by all accounts, treated correctly, the Geneva Convention observed, the food adequate, the conditions harsh by American civilian standards and luxurious by Eastern Front standards. He worked in the camp library. He read widely. He had time, for the first time in years, to think without the pressure of immediate military necessity demanding that all thought be tactical. He thought often about the bottle, not because it was important in itself. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not confused about the hierarchy of the war's causes. The bottle had not beaten him. Logistics had beaten him, and industrial production had beaten him, and the geography of fighting a two-front war while the most productive nation in the history of the world organized itself against you had beaten him. He knew this. He was a professional, and professionals understand the arithmetic. But the bottle stayed with him because it was the moment when the arithmetic became personal, when it ceased to be a function of production reports and shipping manifests and became instead a physical, cold, present thing in his hand, the material evidence of an enemy who had thought about its soldiers differently than his nation had thought about its soldiers. An enemy who had decided that the individual man in uniform mattered enough to be kept, in some small but specific way, connected to the life he was fighting for. That decision, to treat the soldier not merely as an instrument of force but as a person with a person's needs, was not sentimentality. It was strategy. It was the expression, in logistical form, of the democratic that the point of power is not domination but the conditions for human flourishing. The candy and the Coke and the K-ration and the blood bank and the Marshall Plan were all expressions of the same underlying belief. They were different answers to the same question. What does a person need, and how do we get it to them? That question, asked seriously and answered empirically and resourced properly, turned out to be one of the most powerful military and geopolitical instruments in the history of the modern world. Some things, in the end, do not require words. They require only the willingness to stand there and understand what you are holding, and what it means, and what it cost. The bottle cost a nickel. What it carried was beyond price.